They were reading the lie out loud when we walked back into their Senate, and they did not stop reading it to watch us take our seats. The Archivist General of the Vaskar Hegemony stood at the rostrum beneath the great glass dome. 400 senators banked above him in tiers of black stone, and he recited the official finding into the morning light, that Envoy Applauded of Earth had died at terror anchorage of natural atmospheric collapse, that the Hegemony grieved with her people, and that the matter was closed. I had carried her body onto the ship myself. I knew the weight of the lie because I knew the weight of her. My name is Evan Marsh, Colonel Earth Defense Forces, military attaché to the Concord mission. 11 weeks earlier, I had stood in a cold receiving bay on terror anchorage while 2 Vaskar orderlies wheeled out a sealed casket and a stack of documents I was not permitted to question. Now I sat at a small table of pale stone on the Senate floor, the lowest point in that whole vast chamber, with 2 other human beings and the entire hegemony arranged above us like weather. To my left sat Registrar Maeve Halloran, who had not spoken more than 40 words since we made orbit, and whose document cases were stacked beside her chair in a precise gray column. To my right sat Ambassador Cecil Andari, 73 years old, silver-haired, his dark coat buttoned to the collar, his hands folded on the stone in front of him. He listened to the finding the way a man listens to rain. He had told me once on the passage out the only thing he ever said about strategy. A proud house keeps its own knives sharp, Colonel. We will not need to bring one. The Archivist General finished. The first Speaker of the Senate, Ozan Mar, rose on the high dais. The Vaskar are a tall people, plated along the skull and shoulders in dark keratin, their eyes set wide and lidless. And when the first speaker spread his arms, the sleeves of his bronze robe opened like a door swinging wide. He spoke with the practiced warmth of an institution that has never once been contradicted in its own hall. Earth has heard the finding, he said. The hegemony extends indemnity. 60 million trade weights, the envoy's effects returned with honor, and a year of mourning courtesy at our border stations. The Senate trusts this, closes the wound. 400 plated heads turned toward our little table. Somewhere above us, a senator made the soft clicking that passes among them for satisfaction. They expected gratitude. They expected a small species to take the money the way a small species should, with both hands and a bowed head. Andari rose. He was the shortest figure in that chamber by half a meter, and the oldest-looking thing in it except the stone. Earth declines the indemnity, he said. The clicking stopped. Earth invokes the right of question. I watched the words land. For a moment they meant nothing, a foreign phrase in a foreign mouth, and then, tier by tier, the Senate of the Vaskar hegemony remembered its own law. The right of question, the voice of accounting. Older than the hegemony's borders, older than its fleets. The provision that any signatory wronged on hegemony soil may stand in the well of the Senate and question its officials under the oath of the crown before the full chamber, with every answer entered in the book of accounting and binding upon the state. It had not been invoked in 900 years. It had never been invoked by an outsider. The first speaker's sleeves came slowly down. The right of question, he repeated, is an instrument of the crown's honor. It is not a grief right for foreign delegations. It is law, Andari said. Article 4 of your founding charter, reaffirmed at the Concord of Meridian by your own signature. Earth was wronged on hegemony soil. Earth claims the floor. There was a silence with a particular texture to it, the silence of an institution checking whether a thing is technically true. On the high benches I saw robes lean together. I saw a senator of the inner files lift a slate and read again and set it down without speaking. The law was the law. They had written it themselves in an age when they assumed it would only ever be aimed at lesser houses, and they had carried it forward century after century like a ceremonial blade nobody expected to leave its sheath. It was Garrison Marshal Tezek Verne who broke the pause, and that was the first time I looked at him properly. He sat on the third tier among the war benches, broader than the senators around him, his shoulder plates scarred pale where rank brands had been burned and reburned across 40 years of service. Commander of every garrison from the throne world to the Meridian line. Terror anchorage was his. The orderlies who wheeled out Adele's casket had worn his sigil. He laughed, not cruelly even, the way a grown man laughs at a child holding a sword. Let them have it, Verne said to the dais. Let the humans question. The hegemony's honor has nothing to fear from grief. We will answer their questions before the crown, and they will hear the same truth read more slowly, and then they will take the indemnity, because sorrow does not pay for fleets. He turned his wide-set eyes down to our table, and to me they looked like the windows of an empty house. Question, little envoys, the air is free. The first speaker took the mood of his chamber, found it amused, and bowed to it. The Senate grants the right of question, he announced. The oath of the crown binds all who answer. The proceeding begins at the next bell. The tiers began to murmur and shift. 400 officials settling in to watch a curiosity. Beside me, Halloran opened the first of her gray cases without being asked. Andari sat down and folded his hands again. And for one moment, the only moment that whole first day, he looked over at me. Now they have sharpened it, he said quietly, and handed it to us. I want to be honest about what I felt because the record should hold it. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the cold that comes off a thing already in motion. 9 days before we entered that chamber, I had stood at the embassy window on Saroon and counted freighters making orbit over the throne world. Grain registry, survey registry, Concord relief registry, hull after hull after hull, all logged, all cleared, all routine. I had counted them because counting is what attachés do, and I had stopped counting at 60. Earth had said nothing to me about them. Earth had said nothing to anyone. But Adele Kieran used to tell me, in the mess on Terre Anchorage, in that dry, unhurried voice of hers, that her government never sent her anywhere it was not already prepared to come and get her from. The bell rang. The light through the great dome moved a hand's width across the floor. The first witness summoned to the well was the adjunct physician of Terre Anchorage, Ilvith San, who had signed the certificate of death. She came down the long stair between the tiers and the white half-robe of the medical service, and she took the oath of the crown with her palm flat against the iron rail. And the book of accounting opened on its stand beside the rostrum, with a sound like a door unsealing, and the Senate of the Vaskar Hegemony leaned back comfortably into its stone benches to watch the humans embarrass themselves. Andari did not stand. He looked at the physician across the well for a long moment, and then he asked his first question, the first of the short, flat questions that I would listen to for 8 days. None of them longer than a single breath, each one set down like a stone on a scale. Doctor, what time did Envoy Kieran die? The 4th hour of station night, San said. It is in the certificate. Yes, Andari said, it is. He turned one page in the folder Halloran had set before him, unhurried, the paper loud in all that quiet. What time does your certificate say the cabin's atmosphere failed? The 3rd hour. And what time does the station's own air log say it failed? Silence. San's inner eyelids flickered, side to side twice, high above us. On the 3rd tier, Garrison Marshal Tezek Verne stopped lounging. It was a small movement, a settling of plate against plate, and I doubt anyone watched him the way I was watching him. I would have to consult the log, the physician said. Register, Andari said. Halloran rose, crossed the well, and placed a single sheet on the iron rail beside the physician's hand. The station air log for that night, certified under Concord seal, obtained through the freight inspectorate 11 weeks earlier while the Hegemony was still composing its condolences. She walked back. She sat. The whole transaction took 12 seconds and the chamber's amusement died somewhere inside it. The log is before you, Andari said. What hour does it record? San read it. The white half-robe moved with her breathing, faster now. The 6th hour, she said. The log records the failure at the 6th hour. 2 hours after the envoy was dead, Andari said. It was not a question, so no one had to answer it. He turned another page. 400 senators had gone very quiet above us, and under the great glass dome the morning light kept moving, slow and indifferent, the way it moves across the floor of any court in any age, and the proceeding that the hegemony had granted us as a courtesy was 11 minutes old. The physician stayed in the well for another hour, and Andari took her certificate apart, the way a watchmaker takes apart a watch. Without haste and without mercy, one small bright piece at a time laid out on the cloth where everyone could see it. The certificate said atmospheric collapse, a slow mixture failure, the kind of accident old stations have. Andari asked how long such a failure takes to kill. San said hours, gradually, the body sleeping through it. Andari asked her to read aloud the medical scan of the envoy's blood, line by line, and she read it, and the gas saturation it described was not gradual. It was a wall. Adele's blood had gone from clean to lethal between 1/4 hour and the next, as if the cabin's air had been replaced rather than failed, and the physician's voice got thinner as she read, because she was reading her own scan, taken by her own instruments contradicting her own signature. Dr. Andari said, in your professional judgment, does this scan describe a slow failure? San looked up at the tears. I watched her look. And this matters. It should be in every account of those days, not at the first speaker, not at her own medical bench. She looked at the war benches, 3rd tier, and the war benches looked back at her with 400 years of garrison discipline, and then she turned to the book of accounting, where her next words would live forever under an oath that her people fear more than death. No, she said, it does not. The sound the chamber made then was not panic. Panic came later. This was lower, a shifting of stone on stone, the sound of a very large institution moving its weight uneasily from one foot to the other. On the 2nd tier, a senator of the trade houses pulled his slate close and began reading the certificate for himself. 2 benches over, another did the same. By the end of that first day, I had counted 30 of them doing it, senators rechecking documents they had voted to accept without reading, and that small dry sound, styluses on slates, pages turning high up in the tiers, followed the rest of the proceeding everywhere like weather coming in. The first speaker adjourned the session early. Institutions do that when they need to think. We walked back to the embassy through the processional of banners, the three of us and our two escort wardens, under kilometer after kilometer of hanging silk stitched with the names of Vaskar victories. Halloran counted document cases. I counted freighters. There were more of them that evening, riding high anchor over Saroon in the gold dusk, and a pair of Hegemony customs cutters drifting along the traffic lanes the way board police drift past a parked truck. The freighters' transponders blinked grain survey relief grain. The cutters moved on. At the embassy door, a message was waiting for us, hand-carried in the Vaskar style, sealed with the sigil of the garrison marshal himself. Andari read it in the hall without taking off his coat. It was in form an invitation. The marshal proposed a private audience that very night to resolve the misunderstanding as soldiers and practical men resolve things, away from theater and old laws. In substance, it was the first knife shown under the table. Settle now, take the money, or discover how long a proceeding can be on a foreign world where every door, every meal, every breath of air arrives by the hegemony's grace. Andari handed it to Halloran, who filed it, time-stamped, in the gray case marked correspondence. No reply, I asked. That was the reply, he said, and went to bed. I did not go to bed. I stood at the window with the lights off, attaché's habit, and watched the anchorage. And because I had been a garrison officer myself before they ever taught me diplomacy, I found myself thinking not about the Senate, not even about Adele, but about a watch captain I had met once on Terror Anchorage, a young Vaskar named Selek Drosh who had walked the Envoy's corridor every station night for a year, who had played Adele at Stone's twice a week and lost gracefully, and who, on the morning I came for her body, had stood at the end of the receiving bay at rigid attention for 2 hours, far past any requirement of his post, with his eyes fixed on the casket the entire time. Grief has a posture, so does shame. From a distance they look identical, and I had been too far away. The second day, Andari summoned the station's records. Not a witness, the records themselves, which under the right of question must be produced before the Crown, original and entire. The Archivist General Amu Ket carried the Tier Anchorage duty ledger to the rostrum personally, and if you want to know when the Hegemony's establishment first understood that something real was happening, it was then. The sight of their own Archivist General walking a border station's watch ledger down the long stair like a relic, because a human had asked for it and their own ancient law would not let them refuse. Andari had Halloran read the roster aloud for the night Adele died. Watch assignments, corridor by corridor. The Envoy's corridor, Corridor 9, had been walked by Watch Captain Selek Drosh every station night for 13 months. On the night in question, his name was not there. The roster showed a substitution, logged 6 hours before the Envoy's death. Drosh reassigned to the freight ring at the far end of the station, his corridor given to a guard seconded from outside the station's own complement, a name with no service history in the ledger at all, a name that appeared that night and never appeared again. Archivist, Andari said. Who has authority to second a guard onto a border station from outside its complement? Amu Ket consulted nothing. He was an archivist. He carried the regulation in his skull. Garrison command, he said, or the ministry above it. Not the station's own watch commander? No. The substitution code in this ledger is a command code, whose cipher seals a command code, archivist. The chamber had gone the kind of quiet where you can hear the dome's filtration breathing. Amu Ket looked at the ledger. He was an old official of an old empire, and the answer was 4 lines down on a page he had certified with his own brand, and the oath of the crown stood over him like a parent. The substitution is sealed with the cipher of the office of the garrison marshal, he said. Every head in that chamber turned at once. The sound of it was like a tide coming in over shingle. Robes, plate, 400 bodies rotating toward the third tier, where Tezek Vern sat motionless among his officers, with his scarred shoulders square and his lidless eyes half-hooded, utterly still, the stillness of a fortress rather than a man caught. He stood. He did not wait to be summoned, which mattered to him, I think, all the way to the end, that no one ever summoned him to anything. My office seals 10,000 orders in a season, he said to the chamber, not to us. He never once in 8 days addressed a word to our table. Seconded guards, freight escorts, leave rotations. Clerks seal them in my name. If the humans wish to drown the crown's time in clerks' ink, the Senate may price that ink as it likes. The hegemony's honor is not in a duty roster. It was a good answer. The war benches clicked their approval, and the trade houses, who wanted the whole affair priced and closed, clicked with them. The first speaker seized the mood and adjourned. Institutions also do that when they have been given a way out, And that night, the Sarin bulletins carried the marshal's line as their headline: "The Hegemony's honor is not in a duty roster," and the commentary beneath it said the humans had found a filing error and were building a temple on it. I read the bulletins in the embassy with the lights off. Through the window over the anchorage, 2 more freighters made orbit, slow and fat and dull transponders blinking grain. Halloran appeared beside my elbow with a cup of tea I had not asked for. She is from Cork. Her grandmother survived the Atlantic floods on a roof. She does not waste words even slightly. "He's wrong, you know," she said, nodding at the bulletin slate. "It's all in the roster. Empires always are. They write everything down. That's how you build one. Nobody burns an archive like a frightened ministry, and nobody keeps one like a proud empire, and you can't be both." "Which are they?" "That," she said, taking back the cup, "is what the ambassador is asking them, 1 page at a time." On the 3rd day, Andari stopped asking about pages. He asked for the air. Specifically, the engineering log of Terre Anchorage's atmospheric plant, original and entire, under the same provision as the ledger. And when it arrived, carried down the stair this time by a junior archivist, because Amuket had begun sending juniors. Andari asked one question of the chamber's own expert assessors, the technical bench that advises the Senate on matters of machinery, and it was the shortest question of the 6 days. Can a cabin's atmosphere be replaced by accident? The senior assessor was an honest engineer, and the oath was on him, and the schematic of the Envoy's cabin was glowing cyan on the great wall panels 40 meters tall, with the gas exchange manifold picked out in white, and a red flag, their convention, not ours. Red is their color for command authority, not for alarm, marking the manifold's override port. "No," the assessor said. "The manifold accepts mixture changes only from an authorized console. A cabin atmosphere does not replace itself, it is replaced." "Thank you," Andari said, and sat down and let 400 of them stare at the word "replaced" burning in alien script across their own wall in the light of their own. The 4th day did not begin in the chamber. It began at the 2nd hour of the night, with the embassy's duty officer waking me because a Vaskar official was standing at our gate, without lights, without escort, and without an appointment, which on Saroon is roughly as natural as snow falling upward. It was the senior delegate of the Veth, one of the 31 conquered species, a treaty power 3 centuries older than the Hegemony's border, and bound to it by every lane their merchants flew. She came in wrapped in a freight handler's weather cloak over court dress, and she refused the receiving room and stood instead in the unlit hall, and she spoke to Andari for 4 minutes in the flat trade pigeon that diplomats use when they want no beauty in the record. I was present. Halloran was present, time-stamping. The Veth delegate said, in substance, take the indemnity. She said the Hegemony had never lost a proceeding in its own hall in 900 years, and that the ones it could not win it had always found ways to end. A witness transferred, a delegation recalled in disgrace. Once, long ago, a fire in a records annex that burned for 3 convenient hours. She said the Veth had watched small species stand where we were standing, and that the Veth had attended several very dignified funerals afterward, and that she was too old to enjoy another. She said the war benches were not the Senate's fringe. They were its spine, and we were tapping on the spine with a stylus. Andari heard her out with his hands folded. Then he asked her single question of his own. "Delegate, when the Hegemony ended those proceedings, where was your fleet?" The Veth delegate stood very still inside her borrowed cloak. "At home," she said, "where small fleets stay." "Ours doesn't," Andari said, and wished her a good night. She stopped at the door, though. They always stopped at the door, that whole week, every visitor with every warning, because the thing about a proud old order coming apart is that everyone inside it can feel the floor moving before anyone will say the word. At the door, she turned and looked at him, at the small silver-haired alien who had declined 60 million trade weights with 2 sentences, and she asked what every chancellery from the meridian to the core was asking by then, in cipher, at night. "What is Earth's price to stop?" Earth's price was an honest death certificate, Andari said. It was offered 11 weeks of opportunities to be paid. The account has moved on. By morning, the visit had done what midnight visits do, multiplied. The Corps requested formal observer credentials at the proceeding before the 3rd bell, the Alim and 6 others followed by midday, and the first speaker, who could lawfully have seated them in the public galleries among the citizens, looked out instead at the assembled diplomatic weight of the conquered of Meridian and ordered the Western honor boxes opened for the first time since the Hegemony's coronation century. He was managing optics, building a frame of dignity around a thing sliding out of his control. But it meant 31 delegations now sat inside the chamber's oath line, where the book's record runs, where everything said becomes treaty fact. Halloran filed the seating order under evidence rather than correspondence. I asked her why. "Because now they're all witnesses," she said. And that same afternoon, the Hegemony finally did what I had been waiting 13 days for it to do. It looked up. A customs interdictor pulled the freighter Meridian Bounty, grain registry, Earth flag, riding anchor in the outer parking shell, out of its orbit for compliance inspection. Random selection, said the traffic notice, which fooled no one. Nothing on Saroon was random by the fourth day. I read the notice at our table during recess and kept my face administrative while my pulse did. Things unbecoming an attaché because I did not know what was in that hull. I had counted them, mapped them, timed them. I had never been told what they carried, and there are kinds of not knowing that a man gets very religious about, very fast. The boarding took 6 hours. The Vaskar inspectors went through the Meridian Bounty with the thoroughness of an Empire's suspicion at full flower. Holds, manifest, crew records, drive logs, the dust in the corner of the dust. They found 41,000 tons of Terran winter wheat, certified, fumigated, stowed to Concord standard. They found a crew of 9 polite, unhurried, papers immaculate. They found a galley smelling of bread, because the crew had baking going when the interdictor hailed, and the senior inspector was offered a loaf at the lock, and the traffic record, public record, anyone may read it on Saroon to this day, shows that he took it. Grain, the inspection report said, verified to the deck plates, released with apologies for the delay. That evening Andari ate his soup while I reported the boarding, and when I finished he said one thing, instructive in the way recovered artifacts are instructive. They inspected the one ship that was exactly what it claimed to be, he said. Now their own report says the sky above this city is grain. We could not have purchased that document, Colonel. They wrote it for us. I lay awake that night doing the arithmetic I had been avoiding. If even some of those 100-odd hulls were what I suspected, then somewhere in the chain Earth had arranged for the Hegemony's suspicion to land, 6 hours of it exhaustively on honest wheat, which meant the anchorage was not just a fleet wearing a veil. It was a question wearing a veil. The same method as the chamber, run at planetary scale. Invite the proud to inspect, let them certify their own blindness under their own seal, and file the certificate where everyone can read it, state a fact. Produce the record, let their pride sign the receipt. I fell asleep understanding, for the first time fully, that the proceeding was not Earth's response to Adele Kieran's death. The proceeding was the smallest visible component of the response, the part shaped to fit inside a chamber, and the rest of it was parked over my head in clean round numbers, waiting with the patience of a species that had decided, somewhere in its bloody childhood of trenches and terror, that the only argument better than force is a fact your enemy has notarized himself. That night they took their first hostage, though they would not have used the word. The Saran bulletins announced, in the small print where empires bury their nerves, that adjunct physician Ilvith San had been transferred from Terra Anchorage to a research posting on the far side of the Hegemony, effective immediately in recognition of her service, a reward by every visible measure. Also a 9-month transit beyond subpoena, beyond the Senate, beyond us. Halloran filed the bulletin in the gray case marked correspondence, next to the marshal's invitation. The case was filling up. They searched our quarters on the 5th morning. It was beautifully done. We were at breakfast. The staff was Vaskar, and when we returned, nothing was missing, and nothing was quite where it had been. Every document case opened and reclosed with professional respect. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Halloran's cases held only copies. The originals had gone up to the embassy vault the first night, and the embassy vault's contents had gone up to a Concord courier boat the night after that, and the courier boat was gone. Andari inspected the searched rooms with his hands behind his back, like a man viewing a garden, and said his one sentence of the morning. Good. They've started reading. In the chamber that day he called for the console records. The assessors had said it under oath. A cabin atmosphere is replaced from an authorized console. Very well. Which console at what hour, under whose authentication? The demand went into the book of accounting at the second bell, and then the Hegemony showed us how an empire stalls. The console records were security sealed, said the Ministry of Garrisons, and could not be produced before the Crown without endangering the defense of the border stations. The first speaker took the objection gravely and referred it to the Senate's Committee of Privileges. The Committee of Privileges scheduled deliberations. The deliberations had no fixed term. It was elegant, lawful, and infinitely extensible, and the trade houses clicked their relief. And the bulletins wrote that the proceeding had found its natural depth and would now drown quietly in. Committee, as everything does. Andari listened to the referral without expression. Then he rose and asked the first speaker a question so mild that half the chamber missed its edge. Speaker, does the Committee of Privileges sit above the oath of the Crown? Ozenmar's sleeves were still. Nothing sits above the oath of the Crown. Then I put my question to a witness instead, Andari said. Earth summons Watch Captain Selek Drosh. I watched the war benches when the name landed, and I will tell you what I saw, because I have replayed it many nights since. Tezek Vern did not move. But the officer at his left shoulder, his adjutant, a garrison colonel with fresh rank brands, looked at the marshal. Just once. Just for a heartbeat. Looking for instruction, and the marshal gave him nothing because there was nothing to give. The right of question reaches any servant of the crown. The law was 900 years old, and the name Selek Drosh was already written in the book. They flew him in from Terror Anchorage overnight. I know what those orders feel like from the inside. The summons at end of watch, the transport waiting, the long sleepless transit toward a capital that has noticed you exist. He came down the Senate stair on the 6th morning in dress plate that fit a younger soldier, and he took the oath of the crown with his palm flat on the iron, and his eyes found our table once on the way down, and went away again like a man pulling his hand off a stove. I had told Andari about the receiving bay. About 2 hours of rigid attention beside a casket he had no orders to attend. Andari had listened and nodded and said, "Then we will ask him almost nothing. You do not pull on a man standing at the edge of a cliff." "Watch Captain," Andari began. "How long did you walk Corridor 9? 13 months, voice." The honorific of the proceeding. His voice was steady. Garrison discipline holds at first. It is built to. "Did you walk it the night the envoy died?" "No, voice. I was reassigned to the freight ring." "Did you request that reassignment?" "No, voice." "Had you ever in 13 months been reassigned off that corridor before?" A pause, one breath long. "No, voice. Who relieved you?" A seconded guard voice. "I didn't know him." "Did you see Envoy Kiran that evening?" "Before your reassignment?" The cliff. Drosh's inner eyelids closed and opened. Above him, 3 tiers of his entire civilization. In front of him, the book of accounting, open, recording, eternal. The oath of the crown is not a courtroom formality to the Vaskar. It is the load-bearing wall of their whole idea of themselves. To lie under it is not perjury. It is a kind of self-execution. The soul's rank brands burned off in front of everyone. "Yes, voice," he said. "She was at her table. Writing. Did you speak?" "She asked if we would play stones at the usual hour." His voice did not break. It did something worse. It went flat, the flatness of a man reading his own ledger. "I said I'd been reassigned, that I'd come the next evening instead," she said. He stopped. The chamber waited. The book waited. She said, "Then I'll set the board for tomorrow, Captain." In the well of the Senate of the Vaskar Hegemony, no one moved. She had set the board. It had still been set 3 days later, when I walked Corridor 9 to collect her effects. 11 white stones and 9 black ones, mid-game, a game I had assumed she was playing against herself. The detail had gone into my inventory report, a line of administrative debris. Halloran had found it there a month ago and filed it where she files things. Now it sat in the air of that chamber, unstated, and I watched senators on the high benches do the arithmetic of one alien woman calmly setting a board for a tomorrow that certain offices already knew was canceled. "One more question, Watch Captain," Andari said gently, the only gentleness he spent in 8 days. "When you learned of her death, as an officer of 13 months on that corridor, did you believe it was an accident?" The ministry's advocate was on his feet objecting before the sentence ended. The witness's belief was not evidence. The question invited speculation against the Crown's finding. The first speaker allowed the objection. The question would not be answered. It would be struck. The book would not hold it. But the chamber had seen Selek Drosh's face for the 4 seconds the question was alive, and 400 Vaskar are very good readers of Vaskar faces, and there are kinds of testimony that no ruling can strike. The marshal's bench moved that night. Not in the chamber, in the city, the Seren Bulletins, which on the first day had called us a curiosity, and on the third a temple built on a filing error, woke, on the 7th morning, speaking with one voice about foreign manipulation of sacred law, about Earth's freighter traffic riding unusually heavy over the throne world, about whether the right of question, in the hands of outsiders, was a knife at the hegemony's throat. The phrasing repeated bulletin to bulletin, the way phrasing does when it has been issued rather than written. And at the 3rd bell that day, the Ministry of Garrisons formally petitioned the Senate to suspend the proceeding on grounds of sovereign security, and the war benches rose in support, and the trade houses wavered, and the first speaker looked down at our table with something that was not yet apology and asked whether Earth wished to be heard on the petition. Andari stood for exactly as long as it took to say it. The oath of the crown binds the crown. If the Senate finds its own oath optional, the Senate should say so before its gods and its book, and every signatory of the Concord of Meridian will read what it says. He sat. 31 species held protections under that Concord on the strength of the hegemony's sworn law. 31 delegations on Sarun would be reading the Book of Accounting that evening. The first speaker knew it. The trade houses, whose fortunes traveled on conquered lanes, knew it better than anyone in the building. The petition failed. Not narrowly, it failed by 200 votes, because empires are many things before they are brave, and an empire that breaks its founding oath in public has nothing left to tax. But I marked who rose for it, every plated shoulder on those war benches, and I marked Tezek Vern, who through 7 days of his cipher and his ledgers and his transferred physician and his issued bulletins had sat like a fortress on the third tier, and who now, for the first time, was looking down across the well at our table, at Andari, the way artillery looks at a hill. That evening, the anchorage over Saroon held 91 human freighters, riding their parking orbits in the gold dusk, blinking grain, 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 survey, relief, grain. The customs cutters had stopped drifting past them. Someone in Hegemony traffic control had finally done what I had done on the first night, counted and then counted again, and then sat very still for a while. The proceeding had 1 day left, and everyone in the city knew the name of the witness Earth had not yet Cal. They spent a man that night to save the house. The bulletins carried it at the third hour, in the grave font the Vaskar reserved for matters touching the crown. Seal Adjutant Coram Dassa, second cipher-bearer of the office of the garrison marshal, had performed self-judgment before the oath, leaving a sealed testament. The ministry released the testament before dawn, which told you everything about whose grief it was. In it, the adjutant confessed, in clean ministerial prose, with file references, that he alone had keyed the mixture order for cabin 902, that he had acted out of private zeal against the foreign surveillance of the meridian, that he had stolen the use of his marshal's cipher and his marshal's channel, and that he could no longer carry the weight of having stained a great office with a loyal crime. A dead signature under everything. The cipher explained, the channel explained, the marshal unstained, the proceeding decapitated one bell before its final day. It was, as craftsmanship, very good. It had taken them only 7 days of watching Andari work to learn that the answer to a paper case is a paper man. The embassy night staff woke us all. I remember the lamplight in the map room and Halloran in a dressing gown with the testament scrolling down her slate, reading it the way a customs examiner reads a bill of lading from a firm that has cheated her before. Andari read it once, standing, in his nightclothes and his years, and the only thing he asked for was the time. Third hour, I said. Same as the mixture order. Sentimental of them, he said, which is the closest I ever heard him come to anger. And then he was the ambassador again. Register. The right of question reaches the records of any servant of the crown. Draft the production demand now. The service ledger of Seal Adjutant Coram Dassa, original and entire. Postings, transit warrants, infirmary entries, cipher custody log. File it at the chamber's opening, before the ministry can move condolences. You think the ledger contradicts the testament, I said. I think a man composing his soul's last document does not cite file references, Andari said. Earth has seen this before, Colonel. We did it to ourselves for centuries. The convenient confession, the closed case, the grateful institution. Every empire that keeps good archives eventually meets the same problem we met. He handed the slate back to Halloran. The archive does not grieve. It just remembers. The last day of the proceeding opened with the ministry's advocate rising on a point of sorrow. He moved that the proceeding be closed in honor of the adjutant's testament. The question answered, the guilty self-judged, the crown's honor restored at the cost of one zealot's soul, and he very nearly carried the room, because the chamber wanted it. You could feel the want. 400 officials leaning toward the door marked over, where the hegemony lost one clerk and kept its marshal, its senate, and its sky. Even the galleries were still. Grief is the most useful furniture an institution owns. Andari did not argue with the testament. He never argued with anything. That was never the method. He rose, noted Earth's condolences to the adjutant's line, and asked that before any motion to close the adjutant's service ledger, demanded at the chamber's opening, and now upon the rostrum, be read into the book. The first speaker could not refuse. The demand was already in the record, and the oath does not take mornings off. The archivist general read it. I watched him understand it as he read, an old archivist outpacing the room, his voice slowing the way a man's stride slows on ice. Item. 11 weeks earlier, the very season of the envoy's death, Seal Adjutant Coram Dassa had been posted to the Cipher Custody School at Vel. Anchorage by the southern route, a transit of 40 days. Item. His cipher key had been formally sequestered for the duration of travel, logged into the vault of the Garrison Command Complex, per regulation, under 2 witnessing brands. Item. The infirmary at Vel Anchorage recorded him present, in convalescence for transit lung, through the entire week in which a console registered to that same complex keyed a mixture order across 1,100 light years. The man they had buried under the crime was 40 days' travel from the console, and his key was in his marshal's vault, and his own ledger, kept by his own service, sealed by his own office, certified by the same brands now sitting white-faced on the ministry bench, Said so in administrative script 40 meters tall on the chamber's cyan wall. The advocate moved to withdraw the testament. The old jurist of the inner files rose instead, and his question went into the book, where it remains, the shortest entry of the whole proceeding, and to my mind the hinge of everything that followed, because it was the first time one of them said it out loud to the others. Then who wrote it? No one answered. The book records that no one answered. But 400 senators looked at the same third tier at the same moment, and a silence with mass to it settled over the war benches, and in that silence the Hegemony's establishment finally performed the operation it had been refusing for 8 days. It subtracted. A forged confession requires access to the dead man's files. The files belonged to one office. The office belonged to one man. Sitting motionless among his officers with his scarred plate squared, who had now been defended by an altered roster, a transferred physician, an issued bulletin campaign, a suspension petition, and a corpse, each shield raised in his name, each one burned through by nothing more violent than a foreign delegation reading. A man was dead who had been 40 days away from all of it. I want that in this account, plainly where the applause cannot drown it. Coram Dasa, second cipher-bearer, who by every surviving record was a competent officer with a transit-weak chest and no part in any of it. Whether his self-judgment was his own despairing idea of loyalty or something arranged in a corridor, the book does not establish, and I will not pretend to. Earth's lawyers charged no one with it. They did not need to. It had already done its work on the only jury that mattered. The chamber that convened that morning, wanting permission to close the case, now sat looking at a confession their own archive had unwritten, and wanting, for the first time as a body, the thing we had wanted for 11 weeks. The truth, under oath, from the top. That was the hour the Committee of Privileges found its courage. That was why. The Committee of Privileges found its courage an hour later, which is to say, found its arithmetic. With the suspension petition dead by 200 votes, the ministry's last clerk-shaped explanation lying broken in the well, and 31 Concord delegations reading the book every evening, the committee voted to produce the consul records under seal of chamber, and the Senate received them before the midday bell, and for the first time in 8 days the public galleries were full. Empires can smell their own weather changing. So can their citizens. The records came down the stair in an iron lattice case, carried by 2 wardens, and were read into the book by the Archivist General himself, who had stopped sending juniors. Pride again, the same pride everywhere in that building, the pride that would not let an old archivist hide from his own ledgers. He read the console log of Tier Anchorage's atmospheric plant for the night Envoy and Applauded died, and the chamber heard, in their own administrative grammar, the shape of a murder. Third hour of station night, a mixture change order for cabin 902, the Envoy's cabin, alone of all the cabins on the ring. The order carried command authentication. The authentication had not been keyed at the station. It had been keyed remotely, through the ministry's own secured channel, from a console registered to the garrison command complex on Sarone, the throne world. This city, the order had crossed 1,100 light-years of the Hegemony's proudest infrastructure to reach into one small room and change what one sleeping woman was breathing, and at the 6th hour a second order had crossed the same distance to change it back, and the gap between those 2 orders was labeled in the log's indifferent script as a calibration interval. The galleries did not murmur. They had gone past murmuring. The Vaskar in their tears had the stillness of a family hearing a will read, understanding line by line that the house they were standing in had done something while they slept. Ondari let the log lie in the silence for a long moment. Then he rose with a small black case in his hand the size of a prayer book, and I heard Halloran beside me let out one slow breath, because she had carried that case against her body through customs at 4 ports, and now it was going onto the table in front of everyone. "Speaker," Ondari said, "under the Concord of Meridian, an envoy's quarters are the soil of the envoy's own world. Earth now enters evidence gathered on Earth's soil." The first speaker's sleeves moved, some objection assembling itself, and stopped. Their law again. They had signed that clause too. Envoy Kiran kept a desk recorder, Ondari said. It was running. I want to set down exactly what the chamber heard, because the bulletins afterward dressed it in too much music, and what it actually was quiet. The recording opened with the ordinary sounds of a small room at night, a stylus on paper, the click of a stone placed on a board, the breath of the vents. Then a change in the vent's pitch, slight. You would never wake for it. The stylus stopped. A chair moved. And Adele Kiran's voice, which I had last heard in life telling me a joke about Concord customs forms, said, with no more alarm than a pilot reading instruments, "Cabin log, 3rd hour. My air mix has changed. The override port is keyed from off station, so this is decided, and pounding on the door would only entertain them." A pause. The stylus started again, writing. She had gone back to writing, her final dispatch, The one found sealed in her desk safe, the one her government had never released. The vents kept their new pitch. 11 weeks I had wondered about her last hour, and here it was. Paper, breath, and a stone set carefully on a board for a game scheduled for tomorrow. And then near the end, her voice once more, slower now, the gas already at her judgment but not yet at her diction, and it took me a long time afterward to forgive how steady it was. Final entry. Adele Kiran, Envoy of Earth. Whoever ordered this should know two things. Earth will ask its questions politely, and Earth already knows the way here. The recording hissed for a while longer and was stopped by Andari's hand before the part that no chamber needed and no oath required. He closed the case. He did not perform anything. He looked very briefly like an old man who had now heard that recording many more times than any living person should, and then his face resumed its order, and he turned to the dais. Earth tenders the recording to the book, he said, and reserves its final witness for the afternoon bell. They recessed. It was not on the schedule. The first speaker simply stood, and the chamber stood with him. 400 officials rising in a silence that had nothing procedural in it. As we gathered our cases, I saw a thing I had stopped expecting from that building. Down the long stair, against all etiquette, came a senator of the trade houses, an old broad-plated female with merchant brands on both shoulders, and she crossed the well to our small stone table while the galleries watched, and she did not speak. There was nothing her oath would let her say mid-proceeding, but she stood before Andari and performed, slowly and exactly, the Vaskar gesture of debt acknowledged. Both hands open, palms down, lowered to the level of the table. The posture their merchants reserve for a creditor who has been patient longer than the law required. Then she climbed back to her bench, and the recess swallowed everything, and the city of Saroon spent its midday the way a beach spends the hour before a storm tide, busily, with one eye always on the water. I spent the recess on the embassy roof with a signal slate and my own arithmetic. 91 freighters the night before, 104 now. I pulled the public registry manifests because attaché check, and the manifests were perfect, too perfect. Grain tonnages in clean round numbers, survey charters referencing nebulae nobody surveys in summer, relief cargoes for a famine that had ended in the spring. Whoever had built those covers had built them to survive a clerk's glance, not an attaché's 8th day. They had also, I realized, with a cold I can still find when I look for it, built them to be seen through eventually on a schedule. The covers were a courtesy. A veil thin enough that the Hegemony's traffic control was meant, at some point chosen by Earth and not by them, to look up and understand that it had been counting warships for 2 weeks. Halloran found me on the roof. She had a fresh case with her, a small one, black, sealed with the Concorde's courier sigil. It had come up from the spaceport an hour earlier, the first thing Earth had sent us since the proceeding began. No instructions came with it. None were needed. It was addressed to the ambassador for the afternoon bell. "Do you know what's in it?" I asked her. "I know what it weighs," she said, which from Halloran was a full briefing. "Light?" she meant. Paper light, a single document. Below us, the processional was filling with citizens walking toward the Senate, more than the galleries could ever hold. Coming anyway, standing room in the outer courts, because the bulletins had finally torn loose of whoever issued their phrasing, and were broadcasting the proceedings straight, and the whole hegemony had heard a dead alien woman read her own air gauge with a steadier voice than their ministry had managed in 8 days. The afternoon bell rang across Saron, bronze and enormous. "Final witness," I said. Halloran tucked the black case under her arm. "Final question." They had to widen the warden cordon just to get us through the outer courts. The crowd did not jeer and did not cheer. They watched us pass in a silence that had weight to it. Tens of thousands of plated faces turning like a field turning toward the sun, and I understood that whatever happened at the afternoon bell, the hegemony that walked out of this day would not be the one that had walked into it. The chamber was over capacity for the first time in its history. Senators who had not attended a session in years had come in from their estates. The 31 Concord delegations had been seated in a crescent of honor boxes along the western tier, where the law required they be able to see the book, and the light through the great dome came down in one broad gold column onto the well's white floor, because it was mid-afternoon on Saroon, and the sky above the glass was the deep, cloudless blue of their autumn. I looked up through that dome exactly once as we took our table. The anchorage was too high to see by day. There was nothing up there but blue. The first speaker opened the session with the shortest invocation I had heard him give, as if he too wanted the formalities out of the way before his own composure was spent. Then he looked at our table, and his voice, trained across 60 years of managing that room, managed one more sentence evenly. "Earth holds the floor. Call your witness." Andari rose. In 8 days he had never once raised his voice, and he did not raise it now. "Earth summons Tezek Vern, garrison marshal of the hegemony." No sound at all. Even the styluses stopped. The marshal sat among his officers on the third tier with the gold light cutting the chamber in half. Below him, and for a moment I genuinely did not know which way it would go. The ministry's advocate was already rising with a sheaf of immunity, arguments, the war benches were rising with him, and the whole apparatus of objection was assembling itself the way it had assembled all week. Tezek Vern stood up and waved it all down with one scarred hand. That gesture told me everything we would need, and I believe it told Andari too. The marshal would not hide behind clerks and committees in front of his own chamber, his own officers, his own crowd in the outer courts. Not after a dead human had read her air gauge without flinching while his ministry had spent a week flinching at paper. Pride had built every stone of that building. Pride was now walking down its long stair and dress plate, slow and square-shouldered, refusing the rail, and Pride put its palm flat on the iron and took the oath of the crown in a voice that filled the dome. Ask then, he said, to the chamber, never to us. Andari's first questions were so mild that the war benches relaxed. Confirm your office, Marshal. Confirm the chain of command over Terre Anchorage. Confirm that a command substitution code requires your office's cipher. Confirm that the ministry's secured channel terminates in your complex. Administrative facts, already in the book, each one answered with contemptuous ease. Each one another stone tapped into place in a wall the marshal seemed to believe was being built around. Nothing. He answered looking out at the tiers, playing the room, and the room was his. These were his facts, his stations, his hierarchy, and he wore them the way he wore the plate. Your cipher sealed the substitution of the corridor guard, Andari said. Your channel carried the mixture order. Your office logged the calibration interval. A pause. Marshal, how many people hold your cipher? 4, Vern said. Myself and 3 seal adjutants. Were the seal adjutants questioned in the ministry's internal inquiry? There was no internal inquiry, the marshal said, with the flat indifference of a man stating the weather, because there was no event requiring one. An envoy died of station air. Stations are old. The matter was certified. By a physician since transferred beyond reach. On a roster since shown altered. Through a console since shown keyed from your complex. Each clause level unhurried. Marshal, Earth offers you a simpler account and asks you only to confirm it, that your cipher was stolen. That some officer of your command, perhaps at Terre Anchorage, perhaps in your own complex, acted without your knowledge, used your seal, and murdered a guest of the Hegemony while you, like the Senate, like the physician, like the watch captain, knew nothing. That you are not a murderer, Marshal, but a man whose house was used behind his back. Confirm it, name the officer when you find him, and Earth's question is answered. I have thought about that offer for years. It was real. That is the thing the bulletins never grasped. Earth would have accepted it. A rogue officer surrendered, the conquered satisfied, the hegemony humiliated but intact, and the fleet over Saroon would have gone home, blinking grain, and remained a rumor in a traffic log. Andari laid the door open and held it, and the whole chamber saw the door, and the trade houses leaned toward it with their whole survival. And the first speaker's sleeves went still with something close to hope. But it was an offer a proud man could only take by saying, before his entire civilization, that his house had been used, that his cipher walked without him, that 400 years of garrison order answered to someone other than Tezek Vern. Adele had written it in her final dispatch, the one Earth never released in full. I have read it. One line of it lives in every account I will ever give of these events. He is the kind of officer who would rather be guilty than disobeyed. The marshal looked at the open door, and the silence stretched, and the gold column of light from the dome moved a finger's width across the floor. Then he laughed, that same laugh from the first day, the grown man and the child's sword, except now it had to climb out over a chamber that was not laughing with him, and it came out wrong, and I think he heard it come out wrong, and I think that was the last grain on the scale. He turned his back on our table entirely and addressed the tiers, his officers, his senate, his book. You sit in this hall, he said, wringing your hands over rosters and air logs like grain clerks, while the border I have held for 40 years stands quiet above your estates. You sleep because I do not. You signed your concords and your courtesies, and then you sent me to hold the meridian line against everything your signatures invited in, and you never once asked how it was held because you did not want to know. Because knowing cost, the human female was not a guest. She was a surveyor's flag planted in our soil. Her reports mapped the garrisons of the meridian for a power whose freighters do not carry grain. Yes, I have read the Anchorage manifests, even if the Senate cannot count past its indemnities. I judged her a forward instrument of an encircling power because she was one, and I removed her because that is the duty you pay me to perform and pray never to hear described. The advocate of the ministry had gone the gray of dead coral. The first speaker was rising, one hand lifted, some ruling forming, too late. Years too late, the sentence was already crossing the chamber the way the mixture order had crossed 1100 light years, decided, irreversible, keyed from the highest console in the House. I gave the order, said Garrison Marshal Tezek Verne, under the oath of the Crown, into the open book of accounting, in the hearing of 400 senators, 31 Concord delegations, and one small table of human beings. I would give it again tomorrow. The hegemony does not answer to pray, and the war benches stood and struck their plate. It is their applause, forearm against shoulder plate, a hard bronze clatter, the sound of 100 soldiers endorsing a field decision, and it rolled down from the third tier in a wave, and parts of the upper galleries took it up, the old families, the garrison houses, the ones whose names were stitched on the victory banners we had walked beneath every morning. For 3 or 4 seconds, the Senate of the Vaskar Hegemony applauded the murder of Adele Kiran in front of the species she belonged to. I sat with my hands flat on the cold stone table and learned exactly what I am made of because I did not move, and not moving took everything I had ever been taught and a great deal I had to invent on the spot. The applause died raggedly when the trade houses did not join it. Then the chamber was just sound's absence, and into that absence came the one noise left in the world, Ambassador Cecil Andari, closing his folder. He thanked the witness the way you thank a clerk who has stamped your form. 7 words. And I watched 400 faces realize what they had just watched their marshal do, and what the small black case on our table was for, even before he reached for it. Thank you, Marshal. That concludes Earth's questions. Halloran broke the courier seal on the black case and set its single document in front of the ambassador, and Andari rose with it, and the chamber, which had been a stunned crowd a heartbeat earlier, snapped back into being an institution, because institutions understand documents the way soldiers understand drawn steel. Speaker, Andari said, Earth directs the Senate's attention to the Concord of Meridian, Article 9. Somewhere high on the second tier, a senator of the inner files made a sound. He had gotten there ahead of his chamber. He was, I learned later, one of the jurists who had helped draft the article 60 years before, in an age when the hegemony assumed such language would only ever be aimed at lesser houses. Article 9, Andari read, and his voice carried to the top of the dome without ever rising because the room had gone that quiet. Should any signatory power, by order of its government or high command, kill an accredited envoy, and should that order be admitted before the wronged signatory or proven before any 3 others, the offending power's protections under this Concord are void from the hour of admission, its lanes are forfeit, its stations stand open to inspection and seizure, and every signatory is bound, jointly, to enforce this article by all means until the ordering authority is surrendered and judgment is satisfied. He laid the document on the stone table beside the small black case that held Adele Kiran's last hour. The admission was entered in the book of accounting at the 9th bell, he said. Under your law, it cannot be struck. Under ours, it will not be forgotten. Earth invokes Article 9. The ministry's advocate was shouting something about context, about the marshal speaking as a soldier and not as the government, and 100 slates were lighting up across the tiers, and the first speaker was calling for order in a voice that had stopped expecting to receive it. And Tezek Verne still stood in the well, at the iron rail, the only motionless figure in the chamber, because he, I think, had understood faster than any of them. He had read the Anchorage manifests. He had said so himself with his own pride into his own book. It was the senator of the inner files who asked, the old jurist. He rose from the second tier with his slate hanging forgotten in one hand, and he did not address the dace, or the advocate, or his marshal. He looked down at the small human table in the well of his Senate and asked, in the formal grammar the Vaskar reserved for treaty powers, the question his whole civilization had been 8 days too proud to ask. Voice of Earth, the freighters. Yes, Andari said. How long? 9 days before we entered this hall, Andari said. Earth does not begin a question it is not prepared to hear answered. And at that hour, and I will swear to the timing until I die, because I have seen the traffic logs and the timing was the message. At that hour, above the great glass dome of the Senate of the Vaskar Hegemony, 104 freighters riding anchor in the autumn blue shut down their civilian transponders in the same second and lit their true ones. You could not see the hulls, not at first, not at that height in daylight. What you could see, what the whole chamber saw, because 400 faces tilted back as the wall panels began to shriek with traffic alerts, was the dome's own auger glass doing what auger glass does, tagging every contact in the sky above the Capitol with its registry, its class, and its tonnage, in clean cyan glyphs that climbed the inside of the dome like frost forming. Cruiser, cruiser, fleet auxiliary, carrier, line cruiser, bombardment platform, hospital ship, carrier. The glyphs kept coming, tier above tier above tier of them, a second Senate assembling itself in the sky over the first one, and the chamber of the Vaskar hegemony stood beneath it in the gold afternoon light, and counted, the way I had counted from the embassy window every night for a week and a half, 104. Riding parking orbits filed with their own traffic control, cleared by their own customs, fed by their own orbital tugs for 9 days. Earth's answer had been hanging over their heads since before the first question was asked, weighed to the last round number, veiled exactly thinly enough to be found by anyone who looked, and not one office of that whole towering empire had looked, because the hegemony did not look at grain freighters, the same way the hegemony did not look at small species, or at duty rosters, or at the board an alien woman had set for a game she knew she would not live to play. No one screamed. I have heard chambers scream, and this was worse. It was 400 voices failing at once, a kind of pressure drop, the sound of an institution's certainty leaving the room altogether, in a body like air through a sprung seal. The advocate of the ministry sat down in the middle of his own sentence. 2 of the war bench colonels were on their feet with their hands moving in old defense drill gestures, reaching for a fleet that was 1,100 light years away holding a border against nothing. And the Concord honor boxes along the western tier had gone as still as a jury that has already voted. 31 delegations watching the glyphs climb the dome, every one of them bound by the same Article 9, every one of them now formally obliged to choose between the hegemony's lanes and Earth's question. The court delegation chose first. Their senior delegate stood, gathered her staffs, bowed once toward the book of accounting, not toward the dais, toward the book, and led her people out of the honor boxes and out of the chamber. The Veth followed before the doors had finished swinging. Then the Ulam, who held 40 years of garrison supply contracts with the ministry itself and walked out anyway, because contracts mean nothing on forfeit lanes. 11 delegations left in the first 10 minutes, each departure a verdict, each verdict landing on the dais like a blow on a door, and the first speaker stood through all of it with his bronze sleeves hanging and watched his Concord, the instrument of 60 years of Vaskar primacy, the web that taxed half the spiral arm, dissolve in the light of his own dome. Tezek Vern never looked up at the glyphs. I watched him through all of it, soldier watching soldier, and the marshal kept his lidless eyes on our table on Ondari, and what was in them was not fear and was not remorse. It was recognition. The look of an artilleryman who has finally walked the ground and found the other battery had been ranged on his position all along, sighted, loaded, and silent, waiting with a patience he had mistaken for weakness, because patience was the one weapon his doctrine had no entry for. He spoke to us only once then. The only words Tezek Vern ever addressed to a human being, as the wardens of the Senate, his own Senate, moving on the first speaker's stricken order, came down the long stair to take custody of a garrison marshal under Article 9. She knew, he said. Not a question. Ondari closed the last folder and looked at him for a moment, and answered him the way Adele would have, which is to say briefly, and with the door already closing. She set the board, Marshal. The wardens took his sidearm cipher and his rank brand's authority with the 2 formal phrases their law prescribes, and the gold column of light from the dome moved another finger's width across the white floor, and far above the glass, in perfect silence, the first landing barges detached from the carriers and began their slow, lawful descent toward the spaceport of Sauron, carrying not soldiers but inspectors, Article 9 inspectors, with seizure writs for every garrison archive on the Meridian line, because Earth's answer to the burning of Adel Kiran was never going to be a bombardment. It was going to be questions, all of them, under oath. Forever I will set down the night that followed, because the histories skip it. They go straight from the admission to the enforcement, as if an empire is a switch that one sentence can throw. It is not. It is a city first, and I watched the city learn. The session did not so much adjourn as fail to continue. The wardens took the marshal out through the chamber's iron door. The first speaker suspended the sitting until the morning bell in a voice like a cracked one, and the crowds in the outer courts, who had heard everything through the public relay, did not disperse. We walked out through them, protocol gone, the cordon a formality, 3 humans and 2 wardens moving through 100,000 Vaskar standing in the gold evening. And they parted for us in silence, and the silence was not hostile, and that frightened me more than hostility would have. Hostility is an opinion. This was a population checking its own foundations. The processional of banners was the worst of it. Those banners hang 400 years deep, every garrison victory stitched in thread of bronze, and the banner houses tend them the way other cultures tend graves. That night, as we passed beneath, teams were already working at the high frames with hook poles, not removing the banners. Their law has no right for removal. Turning them, face inward, the stitched victories rotated to the wall, the morning configuration Halloran told me from her reading, last used when a crown died. No order had gone out. The houses had begun it themselves, one frame at a time, the whole glittering kilometer of empire quietly turning its face away from the street, and the crowds below watched their own history avert its eyes and said almost nothing. The embassy gate, the stones had started. The first one was already there when we arrived. A single white gaming stone, the cheap station issue kind, set on the gatepost ledge by someone who had not waited to be seen. By midnight, there were hundreds, white and black, brought one at a time by citizens who walked up out of the dark, set a stone on the growing line along the wall, and walked away. No notes. The Vaskar do not leave notes. The stone was the entire sentence. The night staff did not know what to do. Andari did. He had the gate lamps lit so no one would have to place a stone in the dark, and forbade anyone to tidy the line, and went to bed. I did not. Attaché's habit, last night for it. I stood at the window with the lights off and watched two skies. Below, the gate lamps and the slow procession of stones. Above, through the autumn dark, the running lights of 104 hulls now burning openly in formation, and between them and the city, all night long, the moving sparks of Hegemony traffic control performing, with great care, the only operation left to it, keeping its own lanes clear of Earth's. The Concorde's declarations came in through the night, and I read them as they arrived, because they were addressed to the proceeding, and the proceedings record ran through our embassy. The Corps first. Naturally, their squadrons declared for Article 9 enforcement by the second hour, lanes closed to Hegemony military hulls, inspection rights asserted at every Corps port. The VETH at the fourth hour in dry trade pigeon, closing the southern routes. Whatever the old delegate had counseled us in our unlit hall, her government had spent the week reading the book like everyone else. By dawn, 19 of the 31 had declared, and the Hegemony, which had begun the week as the Spiral Arms landlord, ended the night as a debtor whose every road suddenly had a toll gate, lawfully, by clauses bearing its own signature, without one shot fired anywhere in the galaxy. The last declaration I logged before dawn was Earth's own, and it was the shortest, and the bulletins read it aloud all morning, in tones I can only call stunned. Earth declared no blockade, asserted no inspection rights, claimed no lane. Earth's note verbale to the Senate ran one line over the Foreign Secretary's seal, and even now I think it did more work than the fleet. Earth's delegation will attend the chamber at the morning bell, and expects the proceedings record to be complete. That was all. The 104 hulls overhead were not mentioned. They never were, not once, in any Earth document from first bell to last. The Hegemony's archivists, I am told, searched the entire record afterward for the official sentence in which Earth threatened them because their doctrine required such a sentence to exist, and they never found it because no one had ever written it. There was only a question, asked politely, 1,100 light-years from home by a small species that had done its filing, and a sky that had quietly filled with the cost of answering it wrong. In the gray of dawn, before the morning bell, I went down and walked the line of stones along our wall. I counted them, because counting is what I do. 1,040 give or take the dark. Somewhere in the night a Vaskar child had placed, instead of a stone, a small folded paper board, the travel kind, creased white from use, and I stood over it a long time. She would have liked that better than the fleet, I think. I have never been entirely sure. They were both in the end the same message, delivered at different altitudes. We saw what you did. We wrote it down. The morning bell rang. The accounting resumed. What followed was a war by every legal definition and by almost no visible one, and I watched the whole of it from the same small stone table, because the Senate did not adjourn. It could not. Article 9 kept its sessions running day after day like a heart that is not permitted to stop. Every report of the enforcement entered into the book in open chamber, so that the same hall that had applauded the order now had to sit and hear, hour by hour, what the order cost. The first report came that same evening. Terror Anchorage, his station, had been boarded by a Concorde inspection flotilla led by 2 Earth cruisers. The garrison commander, with the marshal in custody and the ministry decapitated by its own advocate's resignation, had queried Saroon for instructions and received procedural noise. So he had made his own decision, the first honest decision in that station's recent history. He opened his locks, paraded his watch in the receiving bay, the same receiving bay, and surrendered the station's archive intact. The report noted one detail that went into the book and then went around the Hegemony like a thrown spark. Watch Captain Selek Drosh had requested, and been granted, the duty of escorting the inspectors to Corridor 9, and had stood at attention outside Cabin 902 for the duration of their work. The second report and the third were the same, and the fifth and the ninth. Garrisons yielding along the whole meridian line, archives surrendered whole, commanders choosing inspection over forfeiture, not from cowardice. I want the record to be fair to them, because I wore a garrison brand of my own once. They yielded because the thing they were sworn to defend was the Hegemony's law, and the Hegemony's law was the thing that had just changed sides. The oath of the crown did not bend, and so the men who held it did not have to choose between their honor and ours. That was the architecture of the whole answer, and it was not an accident. Earth had read their founding charter more carefully than their own war benches had. Earth had aimed an empire's conscience at the empire and stood back and let it fire. Not everywhere, of course. The book holds the exceptions, too. The garrison at Devore Reach chose its marshal over its oath, burned its archive, and put 2 inspection shuttles under fire, and the book records what came of that with the dry completeness their archivists are bred to. An Earthline squadron arrived within the day, took the station's engines and weapons apart at range. With a precision the assessor's bench spent a full session analyzing in horrified technical detail, boarded what was left, extinguished the archive fire, and recovered enough of the records to charge the garrison's commander under the Hegemony's own destruction of accounting statutes. Total fatalities at Devore Reach, 11, all in the first exchange, all of them ours to answer for, the report said. And it was a Vaskar admiral's report, and the phrase ours to answer for sat in the book of accounting beneath the marshals. I would give it again like an entire civilization clearing its throat. In the chamber, the war benches tried twice more to fight it, and both attempts are worth recording, because they show how a proud institution drowns. The first attempt was the motion to strike. On the 3rd day of enforcement, the remnant of the ministry's faction moved to expunge the marshal's admission from the book as testimony given in anger and beyond the witnesses standing. The chamber's own jurists killed it from the floor. The old senator of the inner files, the one who had asked about the freighters, stood with his slate dark and recited from memory the statute his ancestors had cut into the Senate's foundation stone. Words sworn under the crown are stones in the crown's own wall. He who pulls one out pulls the wall down upon his house. Then he asked the movers, in the formal grammar, which of them wished to put a hand on the wall. The motion did not reach a vote. It reached, instead, the precise moment when the war party in the Senate of the Vaskar Hegemony understood that it could not save its marshal without abolishing the only thing that made the hegemony anything other than a large, well-armed lie. And the old families, the banner houses, the ones who had struck their plate hardest in the applause, sat down one bench at a time and were quiet. The second attempt was the fleet. There was always a fleet, the real one, the Meridian Home Squadrons, 400 years of doctrine and tonnage, and on the 5th day the acting garrison command moved it towards Saroon. Not to fire, even they said not to fire. The order read repositioning for the dignity of the throne world. The Senate learned of it from the traffic panels in its own dome, which began tagging the approach with the same patient cyan glyphs that had tagged ours. So did the conquered delegations, 11 of whom had returned to the honor boxes specifically to observe enforcement, and whose own squadrons now stood at Article 9 readiness across 31 systems. And so did Earth's 104, riding their anchors above the capital, who responded to 400 years of approaching doctrine by doing, and the book states this in one line, I have memorized nothing observable, no maneuvering, no challenges, no signals traffic the augurs could read. The home squadrons came on for a day and a half toward a fleet that declined to acknowledge them, that simply hung in the autumn sky over the Senate in its filed parking orbits, lawful and silent and already there, and somewhere in that day and a half the approach began to feel, to every officer flying it and every senator watching the glyphs crawl, less like a relief of the capital and more like a man walking very fast toward an open door that everyone could see was open. The dignity repositioning halted at lunar distance. It held there for 6 hours. Then the acting command queried the Senate for instructions, and the Senate, the same chamber that had granted us the floor as a courtesy to grief, voted, at the demand of the trade houses and with the banner houses abstaining, to order its own home fleet back to the Meridian line because the alternative order had no lawful wording. There was no enemy in the sky. There was only the consequence, and you cannot fire on a consequence. I watched the recall vote from the small stone table, and I will set down what I felt because the record should hold this too, not triumph. Triumph needs an opponent, and by the 5th day there wasn't one. There was a very old, very proud machine discovering, gear by gear, that every path out of the chamber led through its own book. What I felt was the cold of the thing finishing its motion, the same cold off the freighter count on the first night. Earth had never once raised its voice in that hall. Earth had asked questions with a fleet behind its back and an article of their own signing in its hand, and the questions had done what bombardment could not have done in a century. They had made the hegemony read itself. On the 6th day of enforcement, the trade houses moved the motion everyone had been waiting for. Full compliance, immediate, supervised, and carried it by 300 votes. And on the 7th, the first speaker of the Vaskar hegemony, Ozan Mar, came down from the high days. I had not known, until I saw the chamber's reaction, that no first speaker had ever done it during a session. The dais is the office. Coming down from it, in their grammar of stone and height, is what abdication of pretense looks like, and he did it slowly, an old administrator managing the longest stare of his life, and he crossed the white floor of the well to our table, under the eyes of his entire civilization, and he did not perform the merchant's debt gesture, because what was owed was not a debt. He performed the other one, both hands open, palms up, raised to the level of his lidless eyes. The gesture their texts gloss as the showing of empty hands, and their soldiers gloss more plainly. No weapon, no veil, ask. Voice of earth, he said, and the dome carried to every tier. The hegemony submits to the question, all of it. Ask. The terms took 11 days to read into the book, and Andari insisted, over the objection of half of Earth's own conquered lawyers. I later learned that every line of them be read aloud in open chamber, because the proceeding had begun in the open, and a thing that begins as a question must not end as a whisper. I will summarize what the book holds, because the full text runs to 400 pages, and the world has lawyers for that. The Meridian Line was demilitarized under Joint Concord inspection, garrison by garrison, with the hegemony's own oath officers certifying each archive, their law operating their disarmament, which was the design from the first day and the part the military academies still teach. The secret rearmament Adele had spent her last year documenting, the buried foundries and the unregistered squadrons her dispatches had mapped, was broken up under the same writs, and her final dispatch, the one she finished writing while the air in cabin 902 was being decided, 1,100 light-years away, was entered into the Book of Accounting entire, as evidence, which means it is now part of the founding record of the hegemony itself, and will be copied by their archivists for as long as their civilization keeps records. She is in their wall now, stone among stones. They cannot pull her out without pulling the wall down on their house. The indemnity Earth had declined on the first morning was never revived. Earth took no territory, no tribute, no lanes. The trade houses did not believe it for a year. The war benches never believed it at all, and respected it more than anything else we did, because they alone fully understood what 104 hulls over a capital could have taken. What Earth took was clauses. Article 9 stands now in every charter the Concord signs in stronger language. With a shorter fuse, they call it the Kirin article in the commentaries, though Earth never asked for the name, and the right of question was written outward into the Concord's own law, so that the instrument the hegemony forged for its honor and we turned in its hand now belongs to every small species at every great table in the spiral arm. That was Earth's tribute. We made their best law everyone's law. An empire can recover from losing a fleet. What the hegemony lost was the right to be the only one holding the knife. And there was the judgment. The Senate offered to try Tezek Vern itself, under its own statutes which carried the long death. Andari declined that too, and his refusal is in the book, in his own words, all of them, because for once he spent a whole paragraph and I think every word was weighed twice. Earth does not require his death. Earth requires his answer, on the record every year for as long as he lives. Let him be held by his own oath in his own house. Let him be brought before this chamber each year on the day of the admission, and let the question be put to him. Did the hegemony order the death of Envoy Adele Kirin, and let him answer it under the crown, in the hearing of whoever sits in these tiers, until the answer outlives everyone who applauded it. They did it. They do it still. I have attended 4 of those sessions as Earth's observer, and the chamber is full every year, and the old soldier comes to the iron rail and plate, stripped of its brands, and answers the question in 11 words that never change. And the silence afterward is the loudest thing I have ever stood inside. The year I last attended, the benches that had struck their plate in the applause sat with their forearms flat on the stone, the posture their custom assigns to pallbearers, and I understood that Andari's sentence had done what no firing squad does. A death is an ending. An answer, renewed annually under oath in front of the young, is a curriculum. We went home in the autumn on a Concord packet, the 3 of us in 2 sealed cases. One case held the master record of the proceeding for Earth's archive. The other held 11 white stones, 9 black ones, and a folding board of station-issue composite, inventoried by me at Terror Anchorage 11 weeks before any of it, signed back out to me by a Vaskar quartermaster who came in on his rest day to do the paperwork himself, and who held the case against his chest plate for a moment before he handed it across and said nothing, because by then everyone in the hegemony had learned how much can be said that way. On the last evening of the passage, I found Andari at the packet's small viewport, watching the lane buoys go by, and because the proceeding was over and the record could spare it, I finally asked him the question I had carried since the first bell. Did you know he would say it? When you offered him the rogue officer, did you know he'd refuse the door? The ambassador thought about it properly, the way he thought about everything, with his hands folded and his eyes on the middle distance. "Adil knew," he said at last. "It's in her final dispatch, the assessment of the man. I only trusted her work." He glanced at me, and there was the ghost of something in the old face, pride and grief in their permanent treaty. "Her whole life, Colonel," she filed accurate reports. "It would have been poor practice to stop believing them at the end. We buried her on Earth, in the green coastal ground her family had farmed for 6 generations, under a plain stone that gives her name and her office in one line. Her government chose from her last dispatch, not the line about the marshal and not the line about the fleet. The line before those where she sat down, in her dry, unhurried hand, between an air mix reading and an inventory of evidence, the only sentence of general philosophy she permitted herself in 18 years of service. The stone reads, Adel Kiran, Envoy of Earth. A quiet people is not a small one. Selekdrosh has visited the grave twice. He is Warden Commander of the demilitarized Meridian now, the Concord's own appointment, the inspector's inspector. And the first time he came, he stood at attention beside the stone for 2 hours, far past any requirement of any post. And the second time he brought a folding board, and we sat on the wall of her family's field in the rain his people find miraculous, and we finished the game. I had kept the photograph of the position from my inventory report. He had kept the position in his head for 9 years. He plays the way she said he did, gracefully and a little too honestly, and when it was over he set his last stone down and looked out at the gray Atlantic for a long time. Your people never once raised your voice, he said. 1,100 light years, 104 ships, the whole Concord standing to arms, and the loudest thing Earth ever did was turn a page. I have thought about how to end this account, and I keep returning to the chamber on the last day of terms, because the record should end where the proceeding did. The first speaker asked, in the formal grammar, whether Earth's question was answered. Andari stood under the great glass dome with the autumn light coming down gold through, the place where a fleet had hung patient and silent for 9 days, and he looked at the book of accounting open on its iron stand, holding the lie, the questions, the admission, the applause, and the answer, all of it now load-bearing stone in the wall of the house that had tried to bury her in. 2 hours of altered air. Answered, he said. He gathered his folders. Halloran closed her cases. And the 3 of us walked up the long stair and out of the Senate of the Vaskar Hegemony exactly as we had walked into it, without raising our voices, without looking back, and without leaving behind one single question that anyone, anywhere, would ever again mistake for grief. She set the board, we only played it out.